Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our live session today. My name is Larissa. I'm an event planner at Reactor, joining you from São Paulo, in Brazil. Before we start, I have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. The session is being recorded and will be available to view on demand here on the Reactor YouTube channel within 48 hours. Keep an eye on the chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer at the end of the session. I will now turn it over to our speaker for today. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to our third session. I just had to delete that icon there. I forgot about that. So welcome to our third session in a series for the Azure Developer Certification, session 3 of 11. And today we'll deal with Azure Storage. It's one of my favorite topics. You might hear me say that quite a lot, actually, but it genuinely is. There's so much you can do with Azure Storage. It's actually also extremely cost effective. So if you're looking for low cost storage, different types of storage, Azure is your starting point. Of course, today we're going to look at the Azure Developer Certification around storage. It's predominantly to do with blob storage. And you will notice that if you go through the course material, they actually refer to Azure Storage in 3 of the learning paths. There's the blob storage one, which is the one we're covering today. Then there's when we delve into security, there's also at the end of our security when we refer to the key vault. There's also a section on access signatures in there. I tend to include it in my storage section. And then when we talk about messaging, I think that's module number 10 or something like that, or learning path number 10. When we talk about our messaging services, enterprise messaging, storage queues are also in there. So be mindful of that. I'm going to try to segregate it like this, but it might overlap a little bit here and there. All right, so just looking at what we're going to be talking about, we're going to introduce Azure Storage. We don't have a lot of time. We've got about an hour. We will talk a little bit about securing access to storage, the different mechanisms you've got available to authenticate against the storage accounts. Then we will talk about the Blob Storage SDK. More importantly, we will talk about the structure of blob storage. If you understand the structure of blob storage, then the SDK just follows that structure. And you would have noticed if you've attended some of my previous sessions, I generally attach a lot of value to structure in services, right? So if you want to learn about a service, go look for a structure. If you find a structure, you will very quickly see where the service pivots, where there's possibly security sort of thresholds and things like that. So always look for a structure, and you'll see this is we will even talk about structure when we talk about Cosmos DB. There's most systems have got some sort of a taxonomy or structure. And then lastly, we'll talk about lifecycle management, where I'll show you how you can essentially tear down your storage from a hot tier to more cooler, colder, and eventually archive tiers. We will wrap up with a bit of a conclusion. I do have a very specific use case that I want to cover when we talk about lifecycle management. And let me just create a new slide for that now while we're busy talking about this. I will be churning out a couple of drawings for us as well. But there's a very specific use case that I want us to even talk about now. For lifecycle management, one of the scenarios that I always have in my courses is I talk about organizations that might want to send their customers a monthly email, and that monthly email is maybe contains a hyperlink to their monthly statement. and that hyperlink is unique for that individual statement, so it doesn't work for other documents. But they want the user to click on the link for maybe 3 or 5 or 7 days or something like that in the email, and then after that, that email link basically expires, and then they have to go to your user portal to go and download their statement, and then eventually delete those blobs from the storage account. So I'll talk about a use case like that also with lifecycle management and through the SDK. It's actually very simple to do something like that. Okay, so first things first though, storage in Azure is a bit of a wide term. What we are referring to here is we're talking about Azure storage accounts, and I want to point it out that it is this item over here, right? If I say, oh, we've got to talk about Azure storage, there's lots of different types of storage in Azure, right? Storage accounts is just the most prevalent one. It's the one that's that's integrated the most with some of our other services. But of course, we've got SQL for data storage. We've got Cosmos DB, Postgres. There's a variety of different storage components. We've got courses and certifications and entire domains dedicated to storage and data in Azure. Storage accounts is a very specific service. Now, when I started doing this training, this disk component was usually underneath storage accounts here. So storage accounts initially for me, when I started training, ran across all the columns like this, and disks was just another part of your storage account. What they've done subsequently is they've created the concept of a managed disk. So a managed disk in Azure is really a first-class citizen in the portal, and I can reference a VHD file from a storage account if I wanted to, but a managed disk will replace the storage account that we traditionally used when we created virtual machines. It's all still managed through a storage account though, but with a managed disk, the storage account is completely abstracted away, behind the scenes of that managed disk. So you'll notice if I head to the Azure portal and I go do a search for disks here, I'm not a virtual machine guy, but if I hit the create button here, you can see I can create the managed disk. And on top of that, if I specify the source type, you'll notice that I can point it to a storage blob. This might be that VHD file that you've uploaded from your lift and shift migration. Oops, daisies. From your lift and shift migration. So I can reference a VHD file, but once I've created this disk, I can basically go and delete that VHD file. Right. So in the past, when we created virtual machines, the virtual machine always had a storage account attached to it that stored that VHD file. Okay, so that's why disks has its own section here now completely. Other than that, all the features we'll be talking about leverage and piggyback off the built-in storage system and all the capabilities we've got behind the scenes. So you'll notice here that if I go and create and this is the first part. When you create a storage account, you're going to configure certain settings on that storage account, right? And there's different storage account kinds. I don't have a table on here now, but suffice to say, if I head over to the portal and I go and find my storage accounts and I create a new one, you can see I can select my subscription, my resource group here. Let's create a new resource group. Reactor, I'm surprised there's not already one there. I can also go for something like Jazz Reactor. It's just my prefix for all my courses. And then you can see there's the regions that I can select. I want to make it clear here that if I'm selecting geo-redundant storage here, that means that my data is in fact going to be replicated to the regional pair. There's good news and bad news about that. The good news is it does all of that automatically, right? Gives you 6 copies of your data across 2 regions. The bad news about this is that not all our regions' regional pairs are in the same country. So make sure that when you select the region here, that you don't select geo-redundant without being aware of what the regional pair is. Sure, in the storage account, you can replicate your data to another storage account. There'll be an additional transactional cost for that. But if you choose geo-redundant storage, we are replicating the data to the regional pair, which is something that Microsoft decides. All right. Every region or most regions have a regional pair. Make sure that you don't have any data residency issues there. Now, you'll notice that the storage is virtually based on the region that I'm in. So in this case, I'm in UK South. So you can see I've got quite a couple of options there, right? There's actually, if you think about it, there's actually only 4 different options. There's locally redundant storage, basically in the same zone. Then we've got zone redundant storage, basically same region, multiple zones. And then there's geo-redundant storage, right, which is essentially 3 zones in the primary and 1 zone in the secondary region. And then there's geo-zone redundant, which is, no, sorry, this one, geo-redundant storage is, I think, also 1 zone and 1 zone in the secondary. Sorry, I confused myself there a little bit. And then geo-zone redundant is 3 zones in the primary and 1 zone in the secondary. All right. So based on what your needs and requirements are, if the regional pair that you're provisioning to is outside of the borders of your country, and you need that data residency, you might go for locally redundant or zone redundant, because then we won't replicate to any other regions. Also note that you're paying for the storage and the transactions, so you should be thinking, first, not, hey, how do we create one storage account for everything? You should be thinking, hang on, what are our requirements for this specific solution, and then provision a storage account for that. So rather go more granular with storage accounts than not. Okay, in my case, I'm going to go geo-redundant here. And you will notice that we've got a read access copy for geo-redundant, and we've got a read access copy for geo-zone redundant. The 2 geo-redundant options that we've got support a read-only copy in the secondary region, even if the primary is still active. All right. So whenever I specify make read access available to to the secondary region, there's always going to be a read-only copy. We don't have to fail over to start using data from the secondary region. And then I want you to also notice that there's different account kinds. We've got a general purpose V2 account. There's also a general purpose V1 account. I don't think you can select that here, but from our scripting and command line tools, that'll be available. You can also see that I can also optionally choose something like premium. Premium is when you really need high performance, but with premium, you cannot do proper data lifecycle tiering, right? I can only store it in premium storage or delete it. I cannot tier it down if it's in premium storage. You will notice if I select a primary service like Azure Files, it also gives me some options. If I select something like other, it also gives me some different options. If I choose Azure Blob storage and Data Lake Gen 2, it also gives me some options. Now, most of these will be available. In your regions. And but you should notice if I go for something like maybe Qatar Central, you'll see Qatar Central only has 2 options available. It just depends on the maturity of our region in that context. All right, so back to UK South again. I'm going to go next here. I'm going to explain a few things here before I continue. First of all, you will see, and this is why I recommend a very granular type approach, because you'll see there's an option here that enables anonymous access. This does not mean that everything in this account is going to be anonymous. What this actually means is when I create my containers, not Docker containers, you'll see this is part of the structure. When I create a container, I can specify whether the container is going to be locked or whether it's going to be unlocked. And when I mean locked to unlocked, if I've got anonymous enabled here, I can have them unlocked, which means I can have anonymous access to certain containers. Now, think about this logically. This is not something that you want to accidentally happen. And to this end, my suggestion always here is if you've got some content you want to be accessed anonymously, create a specific storage account just for anonymous content. If you need, for all your other needs, create different storage accounts that don't have this enabled. All right, so great. Use Azure policy to ensure that this is not a thing. You want to ensure that only the specific services that only specific services is going to have anonymous access. This might be something like web content, right? Things like CSS, JavaScript files from your website, PDF files, video files from your public-facing website, right? Don't push all of those into app services. That's very expensive compute for static data. Okay, so that's where the anonymous option comes in. I'm going to enable that because I do want to, chuck a couple of demos around there. You can also see that I can default to Entra ID authentication in the Azure portal. That does complicate a couple of things a little bit, but I'm not going to select that, but you can see that I can do that. You will also see that we can enable or disable access keys. Now, the minute I disable access keys, it means that I'm predominantly going to be forced to use integrated authentication to connect and authenticate against the storage account. Right? There are other ways as well, but that's the gist of it. So I'm not going to default to that. I will, however, enable storage account keys. This is a very, very big part of your security strategy, whether you're going to have keys enabled or not. So think about it like this. If you're busy building intranet content, your users are already authenticated in the browser, that level of authentication might work. I can enable data lake storage by enabling hierarchical namespaces. All this basically comes down to is access control lists, or you can really see this as role-based access control per file, right? The ability for me to go to a file or a folder and give permissions at that level. This is usually used for large data sets when we're doing big data analysis, that sort of thing. The rest of this, I'm gonna keep sort of a standard. You will notice here that I've got a default access tier for this account, and this means that if I'm uploading a blob or programmatically pushing a blob through to the service with an application, it means if I don't specify the tier, it will always default to whatever I select here. And then the rest of these are very important. I can guarantee you that you're probably, except for your public-facing storage accounts, those anonymous ones, you're probably not going to need public access. So you might go as far as creating a private endpoint or limiting access from specific virtual networks if you want to keep the traffic to this storage account to the Azure backbone. And then you can see private endpoints, and also I think this is known as hot potato, cold potato routing or something like this, where we're implying that you're going to use your own internet connection all the way to this region, or you're going to jump on the Microsoft backbone in the region that you are at and use Microsoft routing through to the region where the storage account exists. So next here, you can see some data protection, soft delete options. Something that I love asking, something that I love asking in this course is about something called the blob change feed. The blob change feed is essentially the ability for us to take a storage account and for all my transactions on the storage account, we're essentially going to create logs of that. So the logs are in different types of format. I think so there's binary JSON type options that we can use. But this blob change feed allows me to to iterate over the information and actually understand, all right, well, these were the items that were added to that folder over the last 5 days or 4 days or whatever the case is. So really just an audit trail. I'm going to go next here, and of course, we'll have questions towards the end. Just the last thing here, you'll see if you want to bring your own keys for encryption purposes, right? We can also do infrastructure encryption that can only be enabled when you create the storage account. And by the way, if I go to my basics here, this storage account general purpose V2 account, the account kind cannot be changed afterwards, right? So I cannot go to Azure Files type account afterwards. I'm going to review and create here. And while it's busy creating, I'm going to stay mindful of the time. While it's busy creating, keep in mind I enabled anonymous access, I enabled keys. Now one of the best ways for me to point this out is if I go to the Storage Explorer here. And this is, we will get back to this table. We're going to talk to that table quite a bit. While it's busy creating that storage account, let's quickly talk about securing access to storage. Right? How do I secure access? What mechanisms are in place for me to authenticate against this service? So you'll see that we've got a couple here, but I prefer to show this in a tool called the Storage Explorer. There's the Storage Explorer. This is a graphical interface. We've also got some command line storage tools. So this is a graphical interface that integrates, and you can see there, if I go for my content there, it's actually, I haven't signed in to a storage account at all. So right now, if I go for my user account here, you'll see I'm not signed in at all. I installed this last night, by the way. So what I'm going to do is I just want to make sure that that browser is in fact selected so that it pops up on that browser. I'm going to click on sign in to Azure. You'll notice it's giving me a couple of options, right? There you can see which Azure environment you want to sign in. I'm going to just go for standard Azure. It's popping a dialog here on the wrong browser, mind you. I'm going to sign in with this user of mine. I'm authenticated now. Happy days. And immediately it's going to give me access to all the storage accounts that I've got available in these subscriptions. So if I open up Explorer, you can see that there's my prod subscription, there's my dev subscription, and there you can see there's the Jazz Reactor storage account. It's provisioned, and there's all the different services. We'll touch on those in a few minutes. So the first option, as you can see here, is integrated authentication, a single sign-on type capability, which also now works for our file shares, by the way. All right, more on that later on. The next couple of options are easier to explain directly from the portal and from the Storage Explorer. So if I go back to my Storage Explorer and say, hang on, I want to sign in I want to access a storage account. There we go. That's the one I just selected. This is Entra ID authentication. But take a look at the other options. Storage account. Hang on. There's one that looks like it links to a storage account. There's some options here. I apologize for the font size. There's some options here, and you can see there's The one option is account and key. So if I did not enable storage account keys earlier, I will not be able to authenticate against a storage account like this. So this is the account name and the account key. Where do I get this information? Well, very, very easily, actually. My account name was called the Jazz Reactor, right? That's the account name. And if I scroll down to security and networking and access keys, then you'll see that there's 2 keys. We give you 2 keys so that you can rotate successfully and easily. But of course, what you want to do is you want to flip over to key number 2, roll key number 1, flip back to key number 1, and roll key number 2. Right? Something along those lines. So if I show the key, I'm going to paste it in here. And I want you to notice something. The account key, that key over there, does not contain the storage account name, which is why currently it's blank, right? So what's the storage account name? The storage account name, of course, is Jazz Reactor. So I'll paste that there, and it'll probably, if I paste that over there, it'll probably give me a 1. Here we go. There's a 1 because I've already got it over here on the left-hand side. So it's noticing there's a duplicate. So the first option is I can authenticate if I've got the account name and key, but keep in mind that gives me full access to the entire storage account, even management of the storage account. So that's something you typically want to avoid. Now, the other option here is a connection string, but you'll notice that connection string has got 2 options. I will talk about the key first, but then we'll talk about these SaaS options towards the end, because there's a last option, also a SaaS option that says URL. I'll show you where to get these. All right, so first things first, the connection string. Take note, display name. If I go and show the connection string and copy it here, what's it got in there? It's got the account name. So I'm going to copy that. I'll paste that connection string in there, and you will see it has inferred from the connection string the name of the storage account. So folks, what this actually means is if you've got the account name and you've got the account key, you can construct this connection string because there's nothing fancy here. Endpoint suffix core.windows.net, that's not going to change. Default protocol HTTPS, that you can also see is probably going to be the same. All right. So there's nothing secret about that. Sorry, this might happen a few times. There's nothing really secret about this. If you've got the account name and the key, you can create the connection string. But that is, as you can see here, a key-based connection string. All right. So you have an account name and the key, you can generate the key connection string. The SaaS connection string, however, is a bit of a different ballgame. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to go with connection string again, and I'm going to click on next, and I'm going to head back here. This is all I've got under my security and keys, and you'll see from there, there's a section called shared access signature. And here you can see I can be very specific in terms of what I wanted to be able to do. I only wanted to access my blobs, for example, only the objects and the containers, and only the ability to read information, right, and list information. On top of that, I can even specify a start and an end date and specific IP address ranges that I want them to use. And further to this, I can actually go and say, all right, well, those are the dates. I'm going to generate this SaaS using my key number 1. And you'll notice towards the bottom here, there's now a very specific connection string, right? And if I copy this connection string, you will see it's inadequate. You can see it's actually requiring some additional permissions. So I'm actually just going to select all of them just to show you what I mean a little bit later on. Really generate that. There's another connection string there. I'm going to select, paste that over there. And I want you to notice here that there's the blob endpoint, the queue endpoint, the file endpoint, as well as the table endpoint is in there. So all the endpoints are in there, and then there's the actual shared access signature. Let's rather make that blue. There's the shared access signature parameter, and you can see that it's got all that metadata that I had early on the page, the start date, the end date, and then towards the end there's an actual signature. Now this signature was generated using that metadata and using the key. It is not the key. This is a unique signature, and if any of these parameters change, that key becomes invalid. So what happens here is, if we've given folks access and this signature is essentially compromised, I will have to go and roll the key to get rid of this. All right. And then the last option, you can see that I've got, for every service, I've got a URL. There you can see that's the individual token. So I can just copy the token and append the token to whatever blobs, endpoints I've got. That will actually work. Or if I want to use a blob SaaS URL, you can see if I copy the blob SaaS URL, there's the blob SaaS URL. If I go back here and specify a URL, it's going to prompt me for the URL, and this will only give me access to the blobs. Okay, so the reason why I went through that is there's different ways to authenticate, and when you start using the SDK will effectively prompt you for different options, right? And you might use a name and a key, you might use a connection string, you might use a SaaS. The SDK caters for all of those. Okay, so my storage account is actually been provisioned. We're not going to talk about these other options now. We will allude a little bit to queues later on in the messaging learning path, but you can see that there's table storage. This is basically just no SQL storage, right? We support jagged schemas, very, very cheap, very fast, very performant, and very scalable, right? Queues, things like load leveling, entry-level queues, not enterprise queues. File shares is essentially SMB file shares, server message block 3+, more network drives you want to be mapping. What we have to cover here is we have to cover blob containers. Now, the word blob containers is a little bit confusing, predominantly because you might be thinking of Docker containers. It's actually got nothing to do with that. Actually, if I have to describe a storage account container, I like to see this as a cloud volume. You can see it as a cloud volume that you might be creating. Okay, so we've spoken about the authentication, and when we talk about this specific service, the blob storage account, there's a structure involved here, and the structure has got 3 building blocks. You can see there that we've got a storage account, a storage container, and a storage blob. Now, this is very, very easy to understand, right? I instantiate an account client. This is where I basically have to authenticate, right? And then, not have to, but I can authenticate. And then out of this, I can read and enumerate some of the properties for the storage account, the account kind, the replication options, etc. But I can also enumerate the containers. So I instantiate the client. I do a for each container in the client, and then for each container, read the container properties, and again, enumerate the blobs. So we've just got a 3 building block structure here, folks. It's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to understand. There's the storage account. This is the service. This is the service, and then there's the the container. That's the volume that I spoke about. It is here that I can specify whether it's going to be locked or unlocked, whether it's going to be anonymous or not. At container level that I decide that. So don't go in with the approach of, yeah, we're going to create one storage account. We will just make sure some of them are anonymous and some of them not. Segregate your storage accounts. And then based on the container, it's going to allow you to enumerate the blobs, and then I can interact with the blob properties. There's some operations I can call. I can, for example, place a lock on a blob. This will also be part of the course information. So make sure you go through that. There's different types of operations. There's different types of blobs. We've got, I'll write them out here quickly. We've got block blobs. This is basically for everything, all the rest. And then we've got I've got a slide on this. Hang on for a second. We've got essentially log files, and then I've just top of my head, I'll see if I can just pop into the slide later on. I wasn't planning to do that, right? But we've got different types of blobs. We've got block blobs, which you're going to use for static content. There's essentially log type blobs, and then there's also the type of blobs that you might be using for virtual machines. I'll get back to the names a little bit later on. Don't ask me why I'm forgetting them. I've been training this for 5 years. All right. So this structure is important, not just to understand storage accounts and how you're going to be provisioning them, but it's also important from a SDK perspective. So if you wanted to interact with this programmatically, this is also the components you're going to be using. I've put a star next to the structure here because in most of my courses, you will see when I talk about the services, I end up talking about the structure. And you can use a structure sort of approach to understanding most systems, I think, that I've ever been involved in. All right. So what I'd like to do is I should be able to go to GitHub here. I think I've got a storage option there. So this is just this is a GitHub repo that I've got. I just want to show you this quickly. There you can see I'm creating a storage shared key credential called account credentials. This is a new shared credential, the storage account name, the storage account key, right? So I'm using the account name and the key, and then I'm creating a blob. I'm creating the storage service client by creating a new blob server. The blob service client using that account credential, and then you can see. I'm actually zoomed into the wrong section here. Right, so you can see there the service client, and it takes the endpoint. That's a URL, and you can also build that URL with that credential set, and then it's calling the service client.getAccountInfo, and it's essentially populating these values. After this, all I'm doing is I'm enumerating the containers, passing in that service client. So if I scroll down here, you can see enumerate containers async. There's the blob service, the service client. That's the top of the structure. And you can see for each container in client.get blob container client. And then very similar to that, you'll see there I'm passing in the service and the container, and I'm just doing a for each blob in the container. So this structure is critical to understand the storage account on the blob side, but it's also critical to understanding the SDK. Now, I mentioned a couple of operations. That's where I went off my my path there and started talking about the blob types. I'll see if I can list them out for you in a few minutes. I want you to also keep in mind that when I'm talking about operations, I've also got a type of a lock operation. So I can lock the blob and for a period of time, and then make sure that I'm the only person that is updating that blob. So I can so there are options like that, and there's several types of operations that allow you to take out one of these leases on the blob, and that's essentially going to ensure that only my current application service is is making changes to that blob. On top of that, we can also add and enumerate metadata. So the metadata is essentially HTTP headers that you're passing through. If you're using something like the SDK, then there will be properties for that. But we can also add some additional metadata. The metadata generally is split into system metadata, for example, information that we will provide to you, and then there's also custom metadata. So for example, if you were generating a blob and this is this is the customer statement, you might have a column there called customer, and the customer might be Bay 001 or something like that, right? Custom metadata, and you'll be able to also then query this the account based on some of that metadata. All right, so let's take a look at this in action. I've got my storage account here. I'm not going to spend too much time around the source code. If you go to the labs, I'll provide links later on. If you go to the labs, there's a very nice storage account lab that allows you to just enumerate those different levels. But if I scroll down here, you'll notice that there's my data storage. There's all my different services. There's my containers. And if I go and add a container, you'll notice, did I switch that off? I thought I switched this on. All right, there you can see. Maybe not a bad thing to happen at this point in time. There's my blob containers. I'm going to add a container. It will take a few seconds for this to actually come through, folks. Not yet. Give me 1 second. Okay. Still disabled. Very strange. These subscriptions of ours have got some rules, and I just want to make sure the networking, that's still available. Oh, interesting. I cannot change it to be anonymous now. You're going to have to take my word for that. In fact, I'm going to show you from here probably. So this is just another subscription that I've got. So I should be able to show you from here. If I go to my containers and I add a container, wait, this is also disabled. This one should not be so so difficult to get back up and running again. There we go. So you can see at this point in time, I can go and specify private, which means I have to be authenticated. Sorry, that demo took a little bit longer. And then also blob anonymous, which means if I know the URL of the blob, I can call the blob. And then there's also a container component here that essentially allows me to enumerate if I wanted to do something like that. I'm going to go with private first, and I'm going to say web data is the container called. Right, so sorry I had to go to another subscription here, but I needed to make the demo work. That's what's more important. I'm going to upload a couple of files here just quickly. Let me go for my... So I've got a static web application here. Let me go and upload them. By the way, you will see there's the different blobs. It's kind of the tip of my tongue just sort of slipped out of my mind there. You can see the block blob. This is for everything else. Page blobs are typically for virtual machines or database files, right? Sparse data, if you want to see it like that. And then the pin blob is basically for log files. All right. So with a pin blob, you cannot update the blob. You can only append to it. So you can just keep adding and adding and adding. Right. Block blob, you can actually overwrite what is there. But let's quickly take a look at this index.html file. You'll see I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, the URL that is. I'm going to paste it here. And I want you to notice that it's not giving me access. There's the URL, mayberg.blob.core.windows.net/webdata index.html. However, if I flip this over and change the access level to blob anonymous, you will see immediately this becomes available. There we go. There's the website. This is why we say it's a good thing if you start migrating your applications to the cloud, your web applications. It's a good thing for you to take all your website static content, stuff all of that into a storage account container, make it anonymous so that you don't have to be authenticated for all that web content, and then add a custom domain to the storage account, files.contoso.net or whatever the case might be, and reference that from your applications so that your apps that are running in app services or functions, or for that matter, or in containers, are only responding to dynamic requests that require server-side compute. With storage account, we've just got a store and retrieve type capability. All right, last thing quickly before we start taking some questions, Blob Lifecycle Management. I mentioned that our account here is by default in the hot tier. And you can see there from the premium tier, we can only delete. All right. From the hot tier, or from the standard tier, we've got from the standard storage, we've essentially got the hot tier, we've got the cool tier, the cold tier, and then we've got an archive tier. And I want to make it clear that archive tier is offline data. So what you need to do is you need to first inflate the file again by placing it into the cool, cold, or hot tier, and then after that, the file will become available for you to access. Also keep in mind that files that end up in the cool tier need to stay in the cool tier for 30 days. Otherwise, you're going to start paying transactional penalties. I think it's something like 90 days for the cold tier. So you need to think carefully about tiering your blob, your blob storage down. What you don't want is for, blobs to be tiered down to the cool tier and then within 2 days get moved back into the hot tier again. Obviously, the hot tier is, the transactions are cheaper, but the storage is expensive. Well, not expensive. The storage is more expensive, rather. On the archive tier, the storage is much cheaper, but the transactional cost can be a little bit higher, right? So that's just something to be mindful of. Last thing here that I want to chat about before we're done is I want to show you the use cases here. If I go down to my data management, and you can see that there is my lifecycle management, I can go and add a rule that says, all right, this is for our statements, and you can see I can apply it to different blob types for that matter. And in here, I can go and say, hang on, 30 days that it hasn't been modified, move it to cool storage, right? And then add another condition. After 90 days, move it to cold storage, and eventually, go and delete the blob after 365 days or something similar to that. The use case and scenario that I alluded to earlier, where I told you, well, what about the monthly statements? I do want to show you that use case and the scenario quickly as well, even though I'm not going to demonstrate it completely with an application. If I've got the blob container, if I've got the blob container, and you can see my access level here for this container, there's my access level. You can see it's private right now, right? You can see it's private, so I cannot access this file anymore. I need to be authenticated. So if you're using our SDK and you're using that blob client, you can go down to an individual blob. This one now, remember, this one is not going to work. I can go to an individual blob and I can programmatically generate the SAS. And you can see there, I'm going to make this SAS available for 7 days. This is going to allow me to generate a link that I can paste into that email for the customer. You will do this programmatically, of course. And then you will see it's just going to have that SAS signature towards the end. And then you will see this file is now, I can send this mail to the customer. The customer can click on the link in the mail. After 7 days, that link will expire. Right. So I hope you can see a combination of the SDK and the blob lifecycle management as to how you can get quite a bit of value out of these storage accounts to that end. And that, folks, brings me to the end here. I obviously have not been paying enough attention here, so apologies for that one. But just to summarize, to this end, I apologize for that. It's really weird for me to be making mistakes like this. But anyway, so just in conclusion, why storage accounts? There's different storage account types. There's different authentication options. There's a variety of different features that you can get from storage accounts, from blob storage to queues to tables to file shares, right? We haven't touched on that. We'll touch on some of the others in some of the other sessions. And then you can see, I mentioned the structure here. They will test you on the structure in the exam. I'm quite confident about that. And then just from an overall hands-on perspective, that source code I show you, if you go to akka.ms/AZ204 labs, you will see that there's a hands-on lab that walks you through doing that in C# and building your own application that interacts with the storage account. And folks, that's everything I wanted to cover. I'm running 2, 3, 5 minutes late. Let's see if there are any questions. Feels like I really rushed through that. It's a big service. Any questions? Sorry about the demos and some of the slides that didn't have the right information on them. I don't know how to sort that out right now, to be honest.
Hey, we have 2 questions from Mr. Programmer. So the first question was, if I use GRS and region 1 fails, Data is written to region 2. When region 1 recovers from failure, how is data synced back from region 2 to region 1?
So Microsoft will replicate the data. That's something Microsoft takes care of. That's not something that you have to be concerned about. It's abstracted away behind the service. So you can manually initiate a failover and test it if you wanted to, but if the region is down, Microsoft will automatically fail over, and we will ensure that replication happens, behind the scenes. There's not much else I can say to that except for the fact that we will replicate whatever changes you've had back to that region once it's available. I hope that answers that question.
The second question was, can Azure Storage replace OneDrive for file storage, since Azure Storage has backup options?
Well, that's an interesting question to be asking, because if you look at the features here, sure. However, that means that you will have to build an interface that users want to use. You're not going to get users to use the Azure portal, right? So it's not about can it do that, can it not do that. What interface are you going to give to your users? That's the question. And you certainly don't want to give users access to that. Also remember things like, for example, OneDrive synchronizes down to the local device. It gives you offline capabilities. So storage accounts, you have to do quite a bit of configuration to do that. It is possible, but it's going to come with quite a bit of work. But you probably can build OneDrive using storage accounts. That's probably what I would recommend, a better approach, right? So no, it certainly won't replace OneDrive. OneDrive is a consumer service. This is a very technical service, right?
Okay, we got another question if you have the time. Yeah. Does Azure Disk and Azure Storage use HDD or SSD? How is data stored across these?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily have a RAID configuration that we adhere to. It's all proprietary Microsoft configuration and setup and infrastructure. So there's no real RAID mapping that we can say to you it's like RAID 5 or something like that. But you can actually choose. If you choose premium storage, you'll get SSDs, but you can also choose. If I go back into the portal here and I go look for disks, you will see that there's different sizes, and you can see that some of them are, some of these will essentially be SSDs, some of them will be magnetic disks. So you generally have a choice. If you're choosing premium storage, you basically have SSD disks. Okay, but yeah, we are our replication options. Even if you go down to locally redundant storage, with locally redundant storage, we will store 3 copies of the data. Okay.
And that was the last one.
Yeah, sure. I think we started about 3 minutes late. So
yeah.
So we can maybe take another question or two.
Yeah, let's wait and see if any other question pops up.
Thank you, Pablo. I appreciate that. I don't think I've ever gone through storage so quickly. It feels like I've cheated on storage because I went through that so quickly. And I definitely, storage won't be happy with me because I forgot the storage blob names. Can you believe that? I think I might actually have them tattooed somewhere on my body. I'm kidding. I don't have, but it's quite embarrassing. All right. So, folks, I do hope that you learned a couple of things. And thanks for attending. And for those of you that are on my other course, I'll be there in about 2-3 minutes. See you guys in a few minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Just a reminder that all of the event resources that Johan shared with you during the session, such as GitHub repos and Microsoft Learn links, are available when you register for the event. To receive them through your emails. And if you also open the event page, they will be available to you there. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Johan for the content shared today with us. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. So if you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can find the link on the screen or in the chat. We'll see you on the next one.